Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the VCTA Broadband Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians with their government. We'd like to collect you with Delegate Aird. Good to see you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and talking with you today.
I think you still hold the distinction as being the youngest female ever elected to the House of Delegates?
That is accurate. I am still holding tight and true to that title.
Great. So look, we're just a few days past crossover. How are things going from your perspective?
I have to say, someone said to me early on that every day feels like a week and every week feels like a month. And the same remains true after crossover. I think in the past we have not had such a heavy load as we have this particular session. And usually you can count on a number of bills dying in subcommittee or in committee. But we have so many bills that are still alive. And so our committee work is heavy. And there's still a lot under consideration for this General Assembly.
Now, how is your district doing economically? I think the statewide unemployment rate now is about 2.6%, but you represent a very poor community.
That's exactly right. You know, the largest portion of my district is the city of Petersburg, and we have a number of barriers that we're still working to overcome. But I will say that there was some changes to my district since the last time we talked. I had one of those districts that was ruled racially gerrymandered by way of the Supreme Court verdict, and so my lines were redrawn. My 63rd district now includes all of the city of Petersburg still, but now I've gained all of Dinwiddie County, which is far more rural than my Petersburg, and I also have portions of Chesterfield County. In the past, I represented the Ettrick portion, which is just that southern end, but now I'm much further up into the more northwestern area, going from the Cosby area all the way over to Winter Park and Winfrey Store, which is a good mix of rural and suburban.
I know one of your passions, among other things, is economic development. And as I recall, you and Delegate Moorfield had a bill that passed last year to spur economic development.
Yes, thank you for remembering that. You know, one of the things that I find to be true is that in, an economically distressed area, which, more than half of my district is, there are a great deal of similarities. And so it doesn't matter what race you are, what ethnicity, all those different demographics. Poor is poor. And so Will and I came together. He's from the far southwest, and we tried to find a way to incentivize different companies to come to our communities. And so that bill did pass, and it is current law. And in fact, our economic development leaders, they use that as an incentive package offer when they are trying to attract those companies to this area. I would say that I have seen or heard that there are companies that are in Will's districts in Southwest that have actually benefited from that law being in place now. And it's even led to further conversations among localities regarding revenue sharing agreements. And so it's been a great law that has I would say, been used as a true tool to bring even more business to Virginia.
And a really good example of working across the aisle, so to speak.
Yes, which is something that I care deeply about. I think that when there are issues that are impacting our areas, at the core of it is getting it done, regardless of what the party dynamics are.
The schools in your district are still suffering from lack of funding. There's an initiative this year to improve that, but how do you feel about it?
I think the governor has done more than many governors have done in the past to include funding in the budget for things like at-risk add-on and trying to make sure that there are additional supports there in place, especially for urban districts like mine. But I just have to be honest and say that even with that increase, we just have to go much further. There is still a deficit as it pertains to having resources in some of our hardest hit schools on things like reading intervention specialists, school counselors, with all the mental health things that we are hearing about that our young people even are dealing with. There's a huge need for more school counselors. And then just making sure that from an administrative perspective, the things that are needed day to day from an operational standpoint in the classroom, that our administrators have the ability to fulfill. And I had a bill in this session that would have done some of that with the establishment of what's called the equity fund. We did not get there this year, but I am actively having conversations about how do we move in this direction, because quite frankly, the kids in my district, the kids in a number of districts around the Commonwealth, they don't have time to wait. They need those resources now. And that's not even getting to the pay and compensation that our teachers need.
So what about early childhood education? I know that's something that the First Lady is spearheading.
Yes, so there is funding also in the budget, and there is a huge omnibus bill that speaks directly to early childhood education. This is going to go at it from the angle of many community daycares and or home care providers for children that will allow an education component to be utilized to make sure that no matter where you are, if you're a 3 or 4 year old in the Commonwealth, you're not getting left behind. You're going to have the access to educational resources that you need. So on day one, when you start kindergarten, you're going to be up to par with the other kids in your classroom.
Is there the use of much dual enrollment between the high schools and community colleges in your district?
Yeah, so dual enrollment is huge. So my background by profession is higher ed. I'm employed at Richard Bland College of William and Mary, which is sort of an anomaly, the 2-year branch here, the only 2-year residential in the state. But what's true for that institution and many of our community colleges is that you can save money, you can save time by getting a jump start on your education, particularly if you plan on obtaining an Associates of Science or an Associates of Arts. And so there is great popularity among dual enrollment, and quite frankly, I think it's a time saver and a money saver.
There's also a program the governor is promoting called Triple G, I think.
Yes,
Talk to us about that.
Yes, so the governor has launched an initiative that will essentially allow community college to be free, if you will, but it's very specific to certain types of programming. So what he's done and what his team has done is looked at the positions based on the labor projections that are most needed here in the Commonwealth via positions that are going to be opening due to retirements and or open vacancies that we have at this time, and has targeted specific community colleges here in the state that are offering programming in those areas. And if you are willing to enroll into those specific types of programming, there will be a model in place to allow that to have minimal financial impacts for you as a student.
I understand that these would be students who are already eligible, for example, for a Pell Grant, and there are other wraparound financial resources for them.
So we're just going to make it that much easier for you to obtain a sort of a seamless financial avenue into these programs.
And again, I think it may call for some community service thereafter.
Yes, I think so. There are definitely requirements if you are able to sort of receive this benefit of not having that additional cost, that afterwards you're going to at least commit to wanting to give back a little bit by way of your own personal service. And I believe they're working through the different categories in which you will be able to do certain types of things that will qualify as having met sort of the community payback for that financial resource you are.
And also additional funding, I believe, for the HBCUs.
Yes, this is a paramount year for our historically black colleges and universities, and I believe that this governor has put more money in the budget than ever before for our institutions, primarily Virginia State University and Norfolk State University. And, many have asked the question, well, why this dollar amount or why that dollar amount? And I just have to say that for a long time, the needs of some of these institutions has gone ignored, if you will, or overlooked, probably a better word. And so that there is just almost a catch-up that needs to occur to really put these institutions on equal footing with some of our other public colleges and in universities.
Healthcare is a huge issue in your district. I know you have some legislation dealing with maternal mortality.
Yes, so this session I've tried to prioritize two things: maternal mortality, community health workers, and mental health, access to resources. So for Virginia, we have one of the highest maternal mortality rates, and primarily among Black women. And so for me, trying to figure out what is it that we need to do from a policy perspective that's going to try and curb what's occurring. And so as a first step in this direction, I had legislation that would allow for the certification of doulas. And so
that's D-O-U-L-A.
D-O-U-L-A. And so certifying these doulas, which are, for those who are not familiar with doulas, it's very similar to a midwife, but allowing the certification of these birth workers is sort of a first step in allowing them to get to a place of reimbursement. One of the primary drivers of driving down that maternal mortality rate is going to be having access to the necessary care, which can be provided by a birth worker throughout your pregnancy and a little bit afterwards as well. And so these doulas would be able to do that work in the certification, which is sort of the first step, and the reimbursement would allow us to move in that direction. As it pertains to community health workers, these are also individuals who are primarily based in our communities that are doing sort of the follow-up, if you will, after you've been in touch with your physician and they have provided you specific instructions of care, who's actually making sure you're doing that care, you're taking your medicine. Community health workers are doing that work now in the Commonwealth, and they are another entity which we want to have certified, so that it's very clear that there are certain requirements that have to be met for you to actually be qualified as one of those individuals, because a lot of trust goes along with that too. And lastly, I'll just say, as it pertains to mental health, we are actively in a mental health crisis here in the Commonwealth. And so trying to make sure that more people can get access to the resources that they need in that regard is one thing I'm working on. I'm on the Deeds Commission, and so a lot of recommendations have come out of the work we've done in the interim leading up to this session. And so some of the policy that I have is the direct result of that.
In terms of maternal mortality, how long does the risk factor last after birth?
Yes, and so there has been some debate about how long that risk factor lasts. In fact, there is language in the budget that's going to take a look at determining how long that coverage should occur. So I would be putting myself in the middle of that debate if I sort of said specifically that the risk is this long or that long. But what I will say is that the people who are far more qualified than I are going to get around the table in the interim and figure out if we're going to do reimbursement, how long should that reimbursement, how long should coverage service last for? And as a part of that, how do we really define how long that risk continues to go on to need that care?
And has the expansion of Medicaid helped generally in terms of your district's needs?
Yes, so I will be honest and say that I'm more familiar with how Medicaid expansion has helped my previously existing districts. Okay. I would say I'm still getting up to speed on some of the new parts and how Medicaid expansion has benefited them, but I will say, generally speaking, that yes, we have a number of people who are now covered under Medicaid expansion, and I think the legislation that's before us this year that would establish a state exchange program will also stand, if that moves forward, to help even more people.
So there's a federal exchange that people can buy insurance on. Now this would create a state exchange.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Which we have heard from just a number of people that they are eager to see this occur.
Now, what about this phenomenon called surprise balanced billing? I understand there's legislation to deal with that as well.
That is another bill that is before us. And really, if you have gone to your doctor's office or you've gone to even sort of a patient first, if you will, not to name a specific emergency care, but just as an example, and the bill that you get in hand is by no means what you were anticipating. You see charges there that don't seem to be fitting with the service you were provided. We are trying to combat so many of the horror stories that we have heard from families in the Commonwealth about being on the other end of having a bill come in the mail that they do not feel is justified with the services that they have received. And so this is probably the second year this has come up in the General Assembly, and I know that this language is actively being negotiated as it moves through the process.
So this occurs more often than not in an emergency room setting where I go because of an emergency. I have to have surgery. There's an anesthesiologist who is not in my network. A month later, I get a $100,000 bill.
That's exactly right. And you know, what can happen is you'll receive just the bottom line. You won't receive the details of what makes up that bottom line. And so for the sake of transparency, you have a right to know, or should have a right to know, okay, what actually is being considered to make up this $100,000 that I'm now receiving in the mail. And oftentimes you'll receive just general references to why that is there, but not to the level of clarity that's making families feel comfortable about paying that large expense.
And then there's the very high cost of prescription drugs. I mean,
Yes.
for example, a drug like insulin that years ago was reasonable in terms of its price has been raised dramatically.
And I think that it has been on the rise for some time now. You have a bill before us. We have a bill before us, I think, that will actually develop a work group that will look at how we can drive down the cost of prescription drugs as well. And so they will be doing their work in the interim, and we hope come back with a recommendation of some things we can do at the state level to provide a little relief to our families.
There's another long-term issue with the certificate of public need.
Oh.
Every year I see a bill to reform that on the one hand, but on the other hand, there are all these other bills asking for exceptions for a new surgery center
Yes.
somewhere.
So this one is a bit more complex and has been just highly controversial for some time. And I would think most people at home are thinking, COP what? We don't care about that. But from an industry standpoint, and most people take a philosophical position. Either we overhaul the system and think about how to do it differently and do it better, or we allow all these pop-up standalone entities to occur without ever addressing the core and root of the issue.
Prison reform. I know you have a bill dealing with, if I get released tomorrow, what identification do I have?
That's exactly right. So I've had a number of families in the more urban part of my district that talks about when their family members and or individuals that they know are released from prison, they do not have necessarily the supports and resources in place to really pick themselves up. And so this bill that I have is specifically for if you are in prison and or in jail for 90 days, that upon your release or prior to your release, the administrators will help you begin the process to obtain your birth certificate, your social security card, and identification. And that can result in you getting it prior, like it's in hand, ready for you as you walk out the door, and or you'll get it right away as soon as you are back to your place of residence. And I think, you know, we forget oftentimes that with the opioid crisis that we have going on here in the Commonwealth, particularly in certain pockets, that you have more people coming in contact with law enforcement than ever before. And so this need to try and have resources in place that would prevent them from returning, it's just we need to be thoughtful about how we are helping with that.
In that regard, in terms of more contact with law enforcement, hopefully that will be reduced if this decriminalization of marijuana passes.
Yeah, so there is a huge, I think, debate actively occurring as it pertains to legalization versus decriminalization. Legalization is on the shelf here in Virginia. We're not moving in that direction, but there are two bills moving forward, one from the Senate coming into the House and vice versa, that speak specifically to decriminalization. I think what we'll see in the end is that both of these bills will end up in conference negotiating the final language, because they both take two very different approaches. But at the end of the day, both bills are geared towards trying to relieve the burden of those who are engaging in marijuana use.
It also helps drive down the cost of the judicial system.
That's
as well.
exactly right. I mean, you have language in one version of the bill that would prevent sort of law enforcement from targeting you just by virtue of the smell of marijuana. But in the other bill, I'm seeing that language has been removed. And so you would still be, I don't want to say targeted, that might be a poor use, but you might come in contact with law enforcement if they do smell marijuana. And that has been the debate. Are we really decriminalizing if we are allowing sort of law enforcement to still be able to engage with you just solely off the basis of marijuana smell and use? So.
And then I see we're no longer going to suspend driver's license privileges for certain offenses.
As you know, this has been building up for some time here in the Commonwealth. I know that we started with, well, can you have your license suspended for non-payment of fines and fees, which was really found to be unjust, and we have sort of rectified that with work that the governor has done, work with various groups of members here in the legislature, and now this is going even further to say, well, if it's not X, Y, or Z categories, then perhaps we can just prevent the suspension of license altogether. And this is really a bread and butter issue for many families, because if you don't have your driver's license, you can't get to work. If you can't get to work, you can't pay your bills. And so on one hand, we want you to be responsible. We don't want you to even come into a situation where there is an offense and or something that occurs that would even lead to that. But let's just be thoughtful about what that consequence can be, and if putting these consequences in place would lead to further unintentional consequences.
We have an aging population in our correctional facilities. I see there are some bills that would at least allow someone like that, for health reasons or compassionate reasons, to be considered for parole now.
Yes, so there are a few things going on. Geriatric release is highly controversial, and it's been one of those hotly debated topics during this session. And really what we're finding is individuals who are of age, whether or not they should be given the compassion of going home. And to many people, it's an emotional issue. It's a very personal issue. But when you think about the cost factor, the cost of providing their health care while they remain, the cost that just exists from them being in prison to begin with. And so this not only has a budgetary impact, but from a philosophical standpoint, whether or not you are in agreement with the policy is also being debated actively at this time. And so we'll see where we end by the time it gets through the Senate.
Another bill that's been subject to a lot of discussion is the minimum wage.
Yes. In fact, there are several groups here in the General Assembly today lobbying for the version that came out of the Senate, actually, which would take an approach where it would be a minimum wage increase between $9 and $12, not all the way up to the 15. And it would be a regional approach. So it's not equally applied across the state. As you know, out of the House, we passed a version that's from the range of 10 to 15, and it would be a statewide implementation. And so this is another one of those bills where you will see it go into conference, and the final approach that will be taken is going to be hashed out and negotiated into one final deal.
So that regional approach would address some of the concerns that members, for example, in Southwest and Southside Virginia have raised.
Yes, there are some concerns that this could have unintended consequences for small business owners, for areas that are heavily rural and agricultural, that just it's unreasonable for them to be able to meet the needs of raising the wage to that amount. And so this is one way to say, well, you all in Northern Virginia, go ahead, you can do it, you can handle it, but don't bother us out here. So that's one reason they put the regional approach forward.
I think you have a bill dealing with temporary assistance for needy families to create a pilot program.
Yes, I mean, as we're talking about, just families having the resources that they need, I think you'll see that in Virginia, we've had some laws in the books that have had the absolute opposite impacts. The bill that I have, which would lift the cap on families, it's called the TANF family cap, to allow for, if you are receiving TANF benefits at this time and you do have another child, that child is no longer excluded from being qualified for those resources.
Talk to us about redistricting. That's another hot issue. There's a constitutional amendment that hasn't passed yet. I think it has a few more days.
That's right.
In spite of crossover, there's a lot of concern about that constitutional amendment that passed last year. We've had an election.
Yes.
If it passes this year, then the voters get to decide whether they want to have a bipartisan redistricting commission.
That's correct. So, you know, this has been such a hot topic this session, and I want people who are sort of watching this from the outside to know that myself and many of my colleagues, we do not want to be the ones drawing our own maps. And so the opposition to the amendment is by no means about that. I think there is some angst over the language in the amendment that says if there is disagreement on the final decision of what the maps should look like, the appeal is then sent to the Supreme Court.
The Virginia
Supreme Court. And so when you think about the partisan makeup of this body that has been responsible for appointing the Supreme Court, there is some concern over whether or not that group would be fair and whether that group would look favorably upon communities of people of color. And so some of the opposition, myself included, questions whether or not that's the best direction to go in. And so what you'll find is that many of the other bills that have been introduced around redistricting this session is trying to put some guardrails in place and or trying to take another approach. But at the end of the day, we do want to get this right. We do want to make sure there is nonpartisan redistricting so that people are choosing us and not the other way around.
By the way, congratulations on the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment.
Oh, yes. It has been a fight for so long that now that it is done, we can say we're moving on to the next step. And many people have been just part of the outreach and the advocacy for the Equal Rights Amendment. And it was just really historical to see that as we began this new era here in the Commonwealth, that was one of the first things we were able to do.
Lots of gun legislation.
Lots of gun legislation.
Talk to us a little bit about that. There's been lots of success in that arena.
So there, some people might not say success.
Yes.
And my district is one that I would say is pretty 50-50 on this issue. I have an urban community that wants to see gun violence prevention, but then you also have more of my hunters, more of my farmers that actually use these weapons to do things like hunt coyotes, which is a huge issue in my rural communities. And so I will say that this has been very tough for a number of people to not only just proceed with this legislation as thoughtful as possible to make sure that those gun owners who feel threatened, that they realize we are not trying to pass anything that impacts you, but also for urban communities like mine that have high gun violent incidents, that have families that are coming to you crying for something to be done, that this is a way to show that as a Commonwealth, we take these things seriously, and we're going to do our best and make every effort to put common sense gun reforms in place.
Got about 30 seconds left, and I know you've got housing issues. You've got an eviction diversion bill, I believe.
So last year, I was able to chief co-patron legislation with Delegate Collins that would establish a eviction diversion pilot program in 3 localities. This year, we actually went back to try and make a few technical changes, but at the core of the issue, we are just trying to make sure that families who have suffered as part of the eviction crisis, that we can put new measures in place to try and preempt some of that before it happens.
Great. LaSharice Ayer, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.